God, if he's all-powerful, will have the power to prevent any pointless or gratuitous suffering.
I regard suffering and evil as a reason to believe in God. The one thing is absolutely certain, all of us die. What the atheist has to say is, suck it up, that's the way it is.
You think, as a Christian, that torturing kids pointlessly is not something that God would do, and yet here he is apparently torturing kids pointlessly, so deal with that.
As Richard Dawkins says, without an absolute God, it's very difficult to have an absolute morality. Well, I think there is an absolute morality. I think there are things that are objectively evil and wrong.
You said God created the perfect world, so it was perfect with hundreds of millions of years of absolutely appalling suffering.
Why don't you just play whack-a-mole with a couple of those points?
Let's whack them all, because they're whackable.
Welcome to Premier Unbelievable, the show that brings thoughtful Christians and equally thoughtful skeptics together to wrestle with life's biggest questions. I'm your host for today, Andy Kind. Now it's a big one today, one we've talked about before, but it never stops being relevant. It is perhaps the most relevant question when we're talking about God, and it's that of suffering. In a world where suffering is ever present, from natural disasters to human atrocities, the age-old question resurfaces: can belief in an all-good, all-powerful God withstand the weight of such pain? So God is in the dock once again today, and today we're asking specifically, is the problem of suffering the best argument for atheism? For many, the existence of so much pain, so not just pain, but the level of pain, makes belief in a good God difficult. Is that conclusion warranted, though? One of our debaters today will not agree with that. Joining us are two brilliant thinkers, and I mean that without any hyperbole whatsoever. We have Dr. Stephen Law, philosopher and the most famous exponent of the evil God challenge, questioning whether belief in a good God is any more reasonable than belief in an evil one. And facing him, the hero returns, Dr. David Robertson, Christian apologist and minister who's been featuring on Unbelievable for the last 15 years. He's joining us from Sydney, Australia, and he argues that suffering can be understood best within a Christian framework. So, as global conflicts, pandemics, and personal tragedies continue to test both faith and reason, we're going to explore whether suffering is indeed the strongest apologetic or argument for atheism, or if it can be reconciled with belief in God. Let's get going. Welcome to both of you chaps.
Hello.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Great to have you both here. So let's get straight into it. Stephen, I know you've talked about this evil God hypothesis a lot. I hope you don't mind us starting with that again. You've argued that belief in a good God, so try and break down what the argument is. The argument is that you've argued a belief in a good God is scarcely more reasonable than belief in an evil God. Could you start, if you don't mind, by laying out what you mean by that and why you see suffering as such a challenge to theism?
If you believe in a good God, you believe in a God that's traditionally conceived of as omnipotent or omniscient and omnibenevolent, a God with the three O's characteristics, then there is this famous problem of evil, or problem of suffering as it's sometimes called, which arises. And there are two versions of that. And the version that you very nicely introduced for us is often called the evidential problem of evil. And the problem in a nutshell is this, that when we look at the world, we see huge quantities of pain and suffering and moral depravity and so on. God, if he's all-powerful, would have the power to prevent any pointless or gratuitous suffering. Being all good, he will not want there to exist any pointless or gratuitous suffering. And yet, when we look across, the sweep of human history, and indeed before that, we're looking at pain and suffering on such a sort of catastrophic scale that it just seems deeply implausible that there is some good God-justifying reason for every last ounce of it. And that's what there's going to need to be, a good reason for every single last ounce of it. Otherwise, no God. If it's true that a good God would not allow pointless unjustified suffering and evil. So examples of that would be very high childhood mortality rates. We've been on this planet as a species, Homo sapiens, for around about 300,000 years is now the best guess. And for almost that entire sweep of history, and indeed prehistory, your chances of making it to adulthood were really not much better than 50-50. Often children died much younger than that, often in appalling ways, malnutrition or disease or some horrible accident, infection. They would have suffered horribly. Their lives would have been cut short. Their parents would have had to watch their children die, completely unable to do anything about it. And if you ask a parent what's the worst thing they've ever experienced, a parent that's lost a child, they'll probably say that is. It's just psychological torture beyond what we are capable of enduring. In some cases, people take their own lives and so on as a result of the horror through which they have been put. Now that's been going on for 300,000 years. Until very recently, last couple of hundred years, we managed to get the childhood mortality rates down. But that is such a sweep of appalling suffering and misery. It seems extraordinarily unlikely that there's going to be some good God justifying reason for every last ounce of that. And if there's even an ounce, there ain't no God, right? And then if you look back even beyond that, there's animal suffering. I watched one of those sort of nature programs about Komodo dragons a few years ago, and sort of lizards that live on this island, and they take a little nip at a water buffalo. Nothing dramatic seems to have happened, but actually what's happened is that the Komodo dragon has a very dirty mouth and has infected the water buffalo. It's going to take it about 2 weeks to gradually become infected, get sepsis, die. The cameraman is filming all of this over a week or two. Eventually, the animal becomes so weak that the Komodo dragons eventually start eating it alive. Afterwards, the wildlife photographer, the cameraman involved, was asked about what he'd experienced, and he said it was his first ever wildlife assignment, and it will probably have to be his last, because he simply couldn't handle the degree of pain and suffering that he would have been forced to, in that job. That was one animal over 2 weeks, right? Across the face of the earth, that is going on constantly, and it's been going on for literally millions of years before we even show up. If there's a God, there has to be a good reason for every single last ounce of that pain and suffering. How likely is that? Strikes atheists like me as highly unlikely, and so we think it's highly unlikely that there is some all-powerful and benevolent creator behind the universe. So that's the evidential problem. I can talk a little bit about the evil God as well if you want, but maybe
I mean, that's a very good opening salvo, Stephen. Thank you so much for that. And it's not simply the existence of suffering, but what Stephen has said is it's the gratuitous suffering. So the level and the degree of suffering, not just that bad things happen, but that so many bad things happen over so long a period of time, and so many of them seem to be gratuitous. Now, David, we'll bring you in, but certainly as a Christian like you, David, when I speak to other people who are not Christians and try and share the gospel, suffering's not usually the place that they start, but it's always, in my experience, the bedrock argument against God. And again, it's not just the fact that they've stubbed their toe or the fact that they lost a job, but it's, as Stephen enunciated, the level and degree of seemingly gratuitous suffering. So we'll give you some time just to respond in kind, if you don't mind, David, to Stephen's opening statement.
Okay. Well, can I first say it's a privilege to be here with Stephen. He has been very influential in his arguments, and he always presents his case really well. In fact, when I heard, Stephen, that you were the one coming on against me, I almost said, "No, forget it, I'm out of here." So be kind to me. I kind of go.
I almost refused to host when I heard it was Stephen. Yeah. I couldn't cope with it.
I almost go the opposite way, actually. I mean, I'm a bit unusual as a Christian. I regard suffering and evil as a reason to believe in God. I don't go on the defensive approach. I would go the other way completely. Because, and I can give lots and lots of reasons. One is, the most practical one of all, is what are you going to do about it? You know, I know when one of the last times I was on Unbelievable, which was a long time ago, you can work it out, when was the Atheist Bus Challenge. When the originator of that, you know, there's probably no God, which I thought was a bit, so cheer up and enjoy life. And I said, I know that was provoked by the originator of it seeing a woman putting up a sign warning people about hell or something. And I remember saying it's such a middle class thing, because for the mum who's just lost her child, or, you know, the heroin addict who's just absolutely in distress, to be told, hey, there's probably no God, so just cheer up and enjoy life, it's not much of a solution. And I find, I find Stephen's argument very intriguing as a thought experiment, but philosophically and practically, I find it completely useless, because I don't think it helps anybody. And I think you end up going back to both Nietzsche and obviously more clearly Richard Dawkins, who says the universe has all the properties as if there was no good and evil. So when Stephen's talking about good and evil, I want to know what he means. And when he's talking about every single bit of suffering has to be justified, well, first of all, he's not in any position to be able to do that. We've got this amazing thing called artificial intelligence. And I had an argument with Grok last night, and I won. Because Grok didn't have the human instinct and ended up apologizing. And I thanked Grok for being so humble, and then said, yeah, but you're a machine, so you can't be humble. And I think that my problem is that Stephen cannot make that kind of statement because he cannot possibly see all the reasons that there are. And as for things like mortality rates, I got bad news. The mortality rate's 100%. We all die. When we die, that is a very, very interesting thing. And also, I think you need to be very careful about sweeping statements like, for the vast majority of time up until 200 years ago, infant mortality rate was 50%. We have no idea what the infant mortality rate was 100,000 years ago.
No, we don't. There are actual scientists that work on this, and I could point you to that.
Yes, but we don't know. I mean, we literally do not know. It is a huge amount of guesswork. And it's constantly changing. So we actually don't know. So we have to deal with the data as we have it. And mortality rates have varied. But the one thing is absolutely certain, all of us die. And I think what the atheist has to say is, suck it up. That's the way it is. Whereas what the Christian has is, no, we actually have a solution to death. And I think that's the problem. The problem for me is not the cause and the origin of suffering, which I'm prepared to defend, because I think I know what it is. But the problem to me is, what are we actually going to do about it? And I think the atheist position is, well, good and evil, we're beyond good and evil. You know, what is good? What is evil? Who dares define that? And if it's unnecessary suffering, if evil is always going to be defined as unnecessary suffering, who is to determine what's necessary and unnecessary?
So, Stephen, back to you. And again, we're not asking you any questions that you haven't been asked hundreds of times before, but it might be helpful for the first-time viewers and listeners for you to talk about what we mean in this case, what you mean in this case by good and evil.
Oh, yeah. So if I've understood David correctly, he's kind of put three cards out on the table there. So the first is the "what are you going to do about it" then card, which I can talk about in a second. The second is but evil proves God card, which is popular with apologetics folk. And then the third one is known as skeptical theism, upon which that I've written quite a lot about. I'd be very happy to talk about that. So let's deal with the second card first, then, the kind of evil proves God, which is a sort of an internet meme that you find often being promoted by Christian apologists. It's based on a misunderstanding of what the problem of evil is, I think. So the problem of evil is a problem for the theist, but it's not a problem for the atheist, obviously, right? Or not obviously. The problem is a kind of internal problem for theism. So what the atheist critic is doing is they're pointing to the fact that the Christian, or Jew or Muslim, is committed to the existence of this particular perfect being, but is also committed to acknowledging that there is an appalling pain and suffering on such a scale that the atheist suggests that it's highly unlikely that there's going to be some good justifying reason for every last ounce of it. And that is what's causing the problem for the Christian, because they have a conception of God as being good, as being morally perfect, which requires that their God not engage in any such activity or permit any such result. So they're in an internal bind. Something's got to give. They're going to have to give up one of their divine attributes, or they're going to have to say that there is no God, it seems, on the face of it. Or alternatively, they can try and explain away the evil, the appearance of evil, which we can also talk about. Now, in order to point up, set up that problem, the atheist critic doesn't have to believe in good and evil. They can be a moral nihilist. Some days I am a moral nihilist. I'm not really sure. I don't really have I'm not a moral philosopher. This is not my area of expertise. But plenty of, around about. So if you want to know what philosophers think, there's a thing called Phil Paper's survey. You can check it out. You can find out what professional philosophers tend to think about this issue or that issue. So only about 19% of professional philosophers and graduate students even lean towards theism, for example. It's a bit of a minority view, belief in God. 62% lean towards moral realism, but 26% lean away from it. So opinions kind of divided there. And not just because, they're all atheists or something, something like that. It's just a really thorny, complicated issue. So where am I going with this? So this first point about, as I put it, the second card on the table, evil proves God. No, it doesn't. We can run the evidential problem of evil without even mentioning evil. And in fact, I did that. We called it the problem of suffering. Secondly, as an atheist, I can be a moral nihilist and I can still run the objection very effectively. It doesn't really make any difference with what my personal views about morality might happen to be. So that's the second card dealt with. The first card is, what am I going to do about it? Well, I'm going to do...
Sorry, could we deal with that one first? Because otherwise it'll get too complex.
No, we're definitely going to be coming back to it because
we're coming back to it.
Effectively what you're doing is you're running the moral argument for the existence of God, which I'm happy to talk about, but let's deal with that separately. So what are you going to do about it issue? Atheists, generally speaking, do the same things about it that religious people do in this life. We try and help other people. We become doctors and nurses. We invent penicillin and drugs and so on that will alleviate pain. And we give to charities that try and help animals. And we give up eating meat because we're concerned about animal welfare. And we're constantly engaged in all of these kind of activities. Much the same as religious people are. We can do the same kinds of thing in order to deal with suffering. So the idea that we say, oh, you just got to suck it up. No, I don't say that. I say we should do our absolute best to try and mitigate the effects. Having said that, what we can't offer is, to put it crudely, pie in the sky when you die. That's the bit we're not offering. We're not saying, okay, in this life we can do everything that the Christian can do, which we can, but we can't offer some sort of compensatory afterlife because we don't believe in it. That bit's true, but there ain't no such afterlife. So from my perspective, it's not much of a compensation. I prefer to focus on what we can do in this life. And so far as what we can do in this life is concerned, it seems to me it's even Stevens between the atheist and the theist. I don't think it's true that we have to say, suck it up. And then finally, skeptical theism was mentioned. Now, maybe we should just put that to one side and I'll come back to it because it's such a huge can of worms. But the idea basically is that I'm not in a position to know what reasons God might have for allowing hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering and 300,000 years of very high childhood mortality rates. How could I possibly be in a position to think that it's unlikely God has such a reason? We can have a look at that argument.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephen. Well, David, we've got about 3 minutes before the break, and Stephen took us on a long-form journey there, which was wonderful to hear. So we can carry on with your response after the break, but why don't you just play whack-a-mole with a couple of those points?
Just go through the list. Let's whack them all because they're whackable. The internet meme, that's a cheap shot. Because it's not an internet meme. Of course, people put it on the internet. I would say that your paper is an internet meme. People keep repeating it, as an internet meme. It is a cheap shot. It's not something that's come out.
Professional philosophers don't use that one. It tends to be used on the internet anyway.
Well, no, I know it does get used.
Having said
so
that,
does everything. Hang on,
Stephen.
Hang on a minute. Okay. Everything gets used on the internet. It's not a reason for not using it. So yeah, I mean that really, that just does not work. I'll just say my own personal experience was I became a Christian because of Auschwitz, and I remember standing at the gates of Auschwitz. And the problem of suffering is a very real one. To say that the problem of suffering is not a problem for the atheist, that's somewhat naive, and I suspect, it reminds me very much of kind of Richard Dawkins, who did say, suck it up, by the way. That was his answer. His answer was, that's just the way it is, and you just have to accept that. You do what you can, but that's the way. You also, your understanding of Christian theology, just as your understanding of, moral ethics, I think, is somewhat limited. Because the idea that Christians say that God does not permit evil is not true. We say precisely that he does. That's the point. We don't say that everything is out of that. I remember, I may have time to just tell this story, but I remember doing a debate in Oxford, and it was, in Cambridge, and it was a ridiculous motion that, was so biased. This house believes that you can't prove there's a God, which we were on our way to losing incredibly until my opponent, the president of the Atheist Society, stood up and said, Auschwitz is wrong or Dachau is wrong is not a fact. And he said, and I said, I want to challenge it. And he said, I thought you would. He said, I mean, it's wrong, not a fact in the same way that gravity is a fact. And I said, well, no, I'm sorry, I think it is a fact. And what happened was, he said, well, prove it to me. And I said to him, well, it depends where you begin. I said, you begin with the fact that there is no God, therefore there is no absolute morality. And he says, but you're beginning with the fact there is a God. I said, no, I'm not. I'm beginning with the fact, at that time my daughter was 8 years old. I'm beginning with the fact that if you attack, rape, and kill my 8-year-old daughter, that's evil. Okay, I then ask, how do I know it's evil? And I keep going back, until I come to an absolute good and evil. If I was an atheist, I would say, well, actually, it doesn't really matter because, as Bertrand Russell said, she's just a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. And I'm sorry, but that's a dreadful, dreadful way to live. So I'm not going to go there. And ironically, the atheist had shot himself in the foot because he lost that debate. And that, for me, is one of the main reasons that I believe I cannot explain good and evil if they don't exist. I cannot engage with it as just a philosophical argument when I observe both in reality as much as I observe gravity. So I feel that your whole argument is predicated upon philosophical niceties and a lifestyle which is inherently self-contradictory in terms of the philosophy that you espouse, because you're saying that people need to be kind, or good to one another, but there's no reason for that.
Today we're talking about suffering and asking whether suffering is the best argument for atheism. In my opinion, it is the best argument for atheism, if not the only argument. We're having a wonderful exchange of views between Dr. Stephen Law and Reverend David Robertson. And Dave, we'll just come back to you. Before the break, you were really brawling over Stephen's unpacking of the evil God problem. I'll just let you get straight back into it.
Sure. Although I might disagree with you when you say that it's the best argument for atheism. I think it's one of the worst. I think there are other arguments. I think Michel Onfray the French atheist, has some very good arguments. But anyway, that's another. We'll do another one with him.
We'll get you back on to talk about him.
Yeah. So, let me just do the theological, and then Stephen mentioned the practical. So the theological, Augustine in Enchiridion, chapter 11 says this: "And in the universe, even that which is called evil, when it is regulated and put in its own place, only enhances our admiration of the good. For we enjoy and value the good more when we compare it with the evil. For the Almighty God, who as even the heathen acknowledge, has supreme power over all things, being himself supremely good, would never permit the existence of anything evil among his works if he were not so omnipotent and good that he can bring good even out of evil." So that would be the theological argument. So Stephen's saying, well, how do we see that? Well, neither Stephen nor I are almighty, so we don't know. As regards the practical, Stephen is absolutely correct. Of course, atheists can and do behave in very humane ways, if I want to put it that way. I would just argue they're being logically inconsistent. Again, I don't know if Stephen holds to this, but Dawkins would hold to reciprocal altruism, that we do things, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type thing. I love the bit about we invent penicillin. Well, Alexander Fleming was a Scottish Presbyterian, so he may have lapsed from his faith a bit. His son became an Anglican, but that's not the same as becoming an atheist. At least it wasn't then, whatever it is today. No, sorry.
Hold your horses, David. Easy, Tiger.
I know. Sorry, I just like winding people up. And that, the pie in the sky, you see, this is where half theology doesn't work, because the Christian position isn't pie in the sky when you die. It's also steak on your plate while you wait. And I would say that there are many things that, in terms of the problem of suffering, well, that's just the way it is. It's just entirely random. There is no purpose. There is no answer. Because I would argue that the biggest defeater of Stephen's position is not that human beings can do something, and lots of stuff we cannot do, loads of stuff we can't. We had an earthquake here, by the way, last night. And 20 years ago, there was an earthquake here right at my church, which nearly collapsed the church, certainly collapsed houses around, and 20 people died. I mean, that's the world that we live in. I would argue that's not the world that God originally created, but that's maybe another issue. But I would simply say this: my position is, yes, there is a limited human response to suffering, but God's response to suffering is phenomenal, and that is seen above all. We've just finished Easter. That is seen in the cross, which is at one and the same time the most horrific event in human history, but also the most beautiful, because that is God's answer to evil, is the cross of Jesus Christ. I listened to Stephen. Well, I've listened to Stephen a few times, and there was one time, I can't remember when Stephen, when you said something like, there would have to be a spectacular argument for the goodness of God. Well, there is, and he's called Jesus, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Stephen, lots to respond to there. Off you go, sir.
Okay. Well, yeah. So David didn't like the fact that I referred to the God evil proves God move as a sort of internet meme. It's true. He's absolutely right. That just because it's on the internet doesn't make it merely a meme. The problem is that it's almost exclusively on the internet. You don't find, when you find people discussing the problem of evil academically, this move doesn't really crop up very much. It tends to crop up really in debates and videos. And the reason for that is it's not very good, for the reason I explained. And David didn't respond to my point, which was this: that you can set up the problem of evil without using the concept of evil. Indeed, the person offering the argument can be a moral nihilist. It makes not the slightest bit of difference. It's an internal problem for Christianity or Judaism or whatever your preferred religion is. You think, as a Christian, that torturing kids pointlessly is not something that God would do, and yet here he is apparently torturing kids pointlessly. So deal with that. Saying, "Oh, but evil proves God," that's just a distraction. It's kind of a red herring to try and draw your attention away from the problem with which you have been presented. Please don't take your attention away from the problem with which you have been presented. It's still there, and it's still a very big problem that needs to be dealt with. It's true. William Lane Craig did actually try the evil proves God move, and he's a proper philosopher. With me in a debate we had years ago, but when I made the move that I've just made, when I pointed out that actually it doesn't work, he immediately dropped it, and then went on to some other arguments. So
well, I won't. Don't worry, I won't. So
you're welcome to carry on. But if you could actually address the problem of evil, that would be great, rather than sort of steering our attention elsewhere and saying, "Oh, but you need to do this other thing." I don't. The problem is this freestanding problem. Secondly, you're now kind of running the moral argument for the existence of God, which is fine. I mean, it's used. William Lane Craig famously uses it, probably the best known exponent. Lots of religious people, including sophisticated religious philosophers, do not use it and do not even like it. So Richard Swinburne, for example, does not like the moral argument for the existence of God. He does not think it's a good argument for the existence of God. That is your argument. Basically, you're arguing that in the absence of God, there's no objective morality. There is no morality. Basically, it's like do what you want. And this is again very effective apologetics move. Not quite so popular amongst actual academics that discuss this stuff, but it works with the general public very well because it induces a moral panic. The idea is to make people go, "Oh my God, if there's no God, then anything goes, and there is no morality, and I can't tell people that this is right and that's wrong anymore. And we're all, we're going to go to hell in a handbasket, panic." That's the kind of response that's often aimed at when people run this argument, because they're not really running it as an academic argument. They're running it for emotional reasons. We can talk about the argument. It's not considered. It's considered one of the weakest arguments for the existence of God in academic circles. But we can look at some versions and take it apart. I haven't really talked about evil God at all yet. Here's the thing about evil God. It seems to me that the moves that people make, and some of which we're looking at here, in order to try and deal with the evidential problem of evil, are really designed to well, first of all, create a sort of sense of moral panic. That's often quite effective, but also just to create enough of a smokescreen and enough confusion that the person who was committed can continue to think, "Oh no, it's okay. I'm not in that much trouble here. That various moves have been made and it's all very complicated, so probably it's okay, and I don't have to give up my belief." It's that kind of confusion that the Christian apologist is after, because it gives them enough space to continue to retain the belief. Very often these debates, for example, the one I had with William Lane Craig, they're not there to convince atheists. They know they're not going to. It's there to shore up the belief of the believers. That's why these debates tend to take place. That's why we're having this conversation right now. It's presumably to shore up the belief of believers. And it seems to me that actually the one thing that we don't want people to realise, if you're on the opposing team, is that it's pretty obvious that there's no God. And what I mean by that is, well, here's another God that it's pretty obvious doesn't exist. If we take an all-powerful, all-knowing and supremely malevolent deity, just the one, and this world we suppose is the creation of such a being, who would take that hypothesis seriously? And the answer is, of course, almost no one. It's a ludicrous suggestion. And if you ask people why is that ludicrous, very often, in my experience at least, they tend to say, well, look at all the love and the laughter and the ice cream and the rainbows. And, if this was the creation of a supremely powerful and malevolent being, this should look like hell. This should be far worse, like a Hieronymus Bosch painting or something like that. But you know, I can go to the fridge and get some ice cream, and I've got all this lovely stuff and children that love me and blah, blah. An evil God would never permit all of that. Now that just is the sort of mirror problem to the problem of evil. If you believe in a good God, you have to explain why God allows all of the bad stuff. If you believe in an evil God, you have to explain why God allows all the good stuff. And there are moves you can make, many of the same moves, in fact, which we could go through if you're interested. It turns out that you can run mirror theodicies, for example. You can say that, well, okay, God gives us children to love, true, and he hates love, true. Why does he do it? So he can kill them on an industrial scale over 300,000 years and cause the kind of pain and suffering that would simply not be possible otherwise. Parental suffering, parents have to watch their children die. God has to create love. Evil God has to create love in order to maximize suffering. So you can see how this works. You can start cooking up these theodicies to defend belief in an evil God against what seems to be pretty powerful evidence against. Or you could say, well, why does God allow some people to help others and reduce pain and suffering? Free will, of course. An evil God is going to give us free will. Why? Because he wants us to freely choose to do evil. If you're just a puppet being and you do bad stuff, you're not morally responsible for what you'll do because you're just a puppet being. He has to cut the strings. So you freely choose to do evil so that moral evil can exist in the universe. Having cut off strings, some of us choose not to do evil, but to do good. Free will. Evil God doesn't like it, but it's the price he pays for the very great evil of moral evil existing in the universe. Again, I'm just taking a standard theodicy and flipping it. Now, if you go through, and also the skeptical theism, how do you the arrogance that you think that you could know the reasons an evil God might have for allowing all of the goods? How can you know that? You can't possibly. And this is exactly David's point a minute ago. How could you possibly know that? You can't. So this isn't evidence against an evil God at all. For all you know, there's a good reason for every last ounce of goodness in the universe. It's not evidence against an evil God at all. Is any of this plausible? No. It's obvious for anyone with eyes to see. Just look out the window. This is not the creation of a supremely powerful and malevolent deity, and anyone with eyes to see can see it. The trouble is that those in the club have literally thousands of years of practice at explaining away and cooking up various other maneuvers in order to try and convince themselves that it does ultimately all make sense. But for many of us, it just seems obviously ludicrous, in much the same way that belief in an evil God is pretty obviously ludicrous for much the same kind of reasons. And so the beauty of the evil God alternative hypothesis as an analogy is it's a spell breaker. People have cast a spell, like the Emperor's New Clothes. Everyone's convinced themselves that the Emperor really does have beautiful clothes, despite the fact that when they look, there's nothing there, right? But eventually the small child points and laughs, and suddenly the spell is broken, and suddenly everyone can see what previously they were kind of blinding themselves to. And that's really the point of the evil God challenge. It's just a way of trying to get people who have been suckered into this belief system, from my perspective, to just get a moment of clarity when they go, oh, hang on. Everything that I'm doing can be done over there with this alternative belief system, and that one's ludicrous. So, so now suddenly, why do I think my one is any more reasonable than that? It's a kind of a spell breaker, basically, is the idea.
Okay, David, the Emperor apparently has no clothes on.
I'm sorry my answers are so long. I'll try and cut them down a bit now.
No,
yeah. Well, it's because I think we're dealing with so many subjects with certain things. But I mean, but also you have a huge problem because you keep making your opponent's arguments and then ridiculing them, and you're making arguments that clearly you don't understand in terms of your opponent. So it would really help if you took time to consider what other people were saying. So, for example, when you say it's an internet thing and no one's ever considered it and all that kind of stuff, I've read it in the early church fathers, Augustine, Calvin, Aquinas, numerous people. The problem of evil and the question of whether God is evil. And so, for example, there was an early Christian heresy which said there was a good God and an evil God and so on. None of this is, there were things, sex existed before the internet, and so did the problem of the evil God. Then you say, you presuppose that you have the ability to say that it's not a problem for you, but it is a problem for me, and it's an internal problem for me. Actually, it's not an internal problem for me. I find if there was no God, evil would be a much, much bigger problem, because, how to deal with it. You then exaggerate, the kind of argument when you say things like, God tortures kids. Now, that's the level of fundamentalist theology that I would expect from a 6-year-old. It really is not. It's like Richard Dawkins saying, well, who made God then? Which is, to say unsophisticated. I mean, you did say about academics. I find that quite funny, because sometimes I think academics are not all that wise. And, sophisticated religious philosophers, I don't really have much time for them, to be honest. I would rather, the Apostle Paul says that the philosophies of this world, people don't listen. And I think they don't listen. I think they get lost just in their own enclosed ivory academic towers. That thing about torturing kids. Let me give you an example, a real practical example. So, I used to live in the Scottish Highlands. I was a minister there. And I would go and take a minibus around and collect kids for a kids club. And one time I stopped, and there was a girl who we normally picked up, and her dad came to the door. And this is a Christian program, so I won't repeat what he said, but it wasn't very nice, and told me where to go. And I said, whoa, what's happened? What's wrong? He said, well, I didn't know you believed in God. Now, I'm a minister. It kind of goes with the territory, at least in my denomination it did. And he then said, well, I hate God. So I did a smart answer, which was really wrong. I just said to him, well, how can you hate a being in whom you don't believe? And he then said, well, my wife died of cancer 2 years ago. And he said that some Christians had told him that it was God who had done it. Now, I told him that was entirely wrong. And we started talking about cancer and everything else. And I remember going back to him every week for about 6 weeks or so as we discussed and talked about these things. I don't think I convinced him, because the 7th week he told me not to come back. But the point about it is this. God didn't say, all right, I'm going to kill her, or I'm going to torture that kid. When I go out of here and I'm, say if I cycle home and I crash into a tree, I'm not going to say, well, God did that. I mean, that would turn all human beings just into robots. So I think the argument is a little bit facetious. The objective morality is actually a very real one. And again, when you say religious academic philosophers don't accept the moral argument, well, I don't accept what religious academic philosophers say. Just because they have a title and a PhD doesn't mean that they're wise. The reality is there is good and evil. As Richard Dawkins says, and he's not a philosopher because he hates philosophy, but as he does say, without an absolute God, it's very difficult to have an absolute morality. Well, I think there is an absolute morality. I think there are things that are objectively evil and wrong. And therefore, that's again for the argument for God. As for the moral panic, that's quite funny. Where's the biggest moral panic in our society? In the universities. I mean, it's incredible what happens in the universities. I remember going to a university and being required to send my talk so it could be vetted in case there was any blasphemies against the current moral teaching. And then people would say, you cannot have that guy speak because he's transphobic or whatever. So moral panic. Again, Stephen, you do too many cheap shots. That's a cheap shot. It's not because of a moral panic. When people are concerned about morality, that's actually quite a good thing. I don't want to live in a society where it's okay for people to break into my house and rob it. I don't want to live in a society where the strong suppress the weak. I don't want to live in a Nietzschean society. I don't want to live in a racist society or anything like that. So to shore up the faith of believers, again, I'm sorry, but that was another cheap shot. That is not the point of this program. And it's certainly not my case for being here. All my life, I have worked on the basis that I'm aiming to convince unbelievers, and it works. It does work. I'm amazed how many, I think there were more people converted through Richard Dawkins to Christianity than the other way around. And I remember getting an email from an atheist who told me that he'd become a Christian through the arguments and everything else. So that's the reason I do it. I want you to see the glory of God and the beauty of Christ, and to realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm the one who's walking around with no clothes, instead of just assuming it's other people. The Bible has a very good description of this, by the way. Psalm 14, verse 1, which Paul quotes, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And, I think that's where I would go with all of that. The problem, your evil God thing. Okay, so we went there. I was kind of hoping we wouldn't go. The biggest problem with your issue is the question of symmetry. You're assuming that there's a symmetry between a good God and an evil God. And I don't accept that. For example, you talk about maximum amount of evil. Why would an evil God kill people when killing them just gets rid of them? Why doesn't he just leave them alive to torture them? If there's an evil God who goes for maximum evil, you're trying to say, you're trying to be clever, and it's a neat philosophical argument because you don't believe it. And you're right, it is absolute nonsense. Where you're wrong is saying a good God is just as equally absolute nonsense. You think it works because of symmetry, but the symmetry doesn't work. Maybe I think I've got one other thing perhaps I'm going to say when we come back on that, because I think your moral God argument is worth discussing.
Stephen, let's go back to you. We don't have huge amounts of time. It will fly. So what do you make of David's response to the evidential problem of evil?
Right. Well, so just to recap, I mean, the evidential problem that we're looking at is very specifically a problem for those who believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing and all-good God. On the face of it, there appears to be enormous amounts of suffering, hundreds of millions of years of appalling, beyond our imagination suffering, very high childhood mortality rates over 300,000 years, the suffering of the children, the parental psychological suffering. There needs to be a good, adequate, God-justifying reason for allowing every last ounce of that. Or else there's no God. How likely is it that there is such a good God-justifying reason? It seems to me highly unlikely. How is David responding to that? Well, I think there are a number of responses, but I think the main one, the one he mentioned last, actually, was that, well, if I don't believe in God, I've got an even bigger problem of evil. But that, it seems to me, that move just trades on using the word problem of evil into different ways and muddling things up a bit. We're talking about the problem of evil, which is a problem for those who believe, specifically for those who believe in the existence of God. There's the problem of how we deal with evil, which we've all got, of course, which is another problem entirely. And it's true that, if you believe in God and you believe that you're going to have some sort of afterlife and so on, that might help you cope with the evil that you experience in the living. I'll get to meet my dead child in the afterlife, so now I can feel a bit better as a result. So there's no doubt that Christianity offers something along those lines, but that's irrelevant because we're dealing with the evidential problem of evil, which is specifically an argument against the existence of God. What is David's response to that? This is no response. He also then mentions, and I suspect this is his main response really, that we can't know what reasons God might have. He's so big and we're so tiny. How could we possibly know what reasons God might have for unleashing hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before we show up, or 300,000 years of very high childhood mortality rates? Maybe there is a very good reason for every last ounce of that. Just because we can't think of it doesn't mean it's not there. This is an academic move that some academic philosophers have become quite fashionable recently. It's called skeptical theism. There is a problem with it, which I'll come to in a minute, but I feel like I probably should stop there.
That's very gracious of you. Yeah, I mean, we do want to bring you back on skeptical theism, but David, over to you then.
Yeah, sure. So when we did that last bit, I talked about the symmetry thing, and I want to say whether there's a real problem here for Stephen. If an evil God freely gives us free will in order to enhance our evil, the trouble is that free will is itself a good thing, and he's giving us a good thing now. An absolutely evil God would give us nothing good. And whereas the Christian argument is, and you keep saying this is a problem for Christians, and I keep telling you, I'm sorry, I am a Christian, it's not a problem for me. I think Augustine's answers is more than enough. My problem is when I observe evil in the world, what we do about it and everything else. You also spoke about the spell breaker. I think the spell breaker is this. Romans chapter 1, Paul says that God's eternal power, divine nature, being clearly understood from what is being made, and we suppress the truth. And I think that's what we do. And to be honest, I think that's what academics are doing. They live in a small, enclosed world, and they suppress the truth. I think that, Ecclesiastes 3 says that God has made everything beautiful in its time. He's also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet we cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. So just to argue against what you were saying just there, I would say that actually we can know some of the reasons for suffering if God reveals it to us, and he does. Secondly, I think that the problem of evil for the atheist is not just how you deal with it, but also how you define it, since evil cannot exist in a universe that is entirely materialistic. And I think you keep repeating the same statement of faith. It seems highly unlikely to you. Well, so what? There could be 1,000 reasons it seems highly unlikely to you. And just saying, in academic philosophy, I would say, well, what if academic philosophers are wrong? Because you mentioned the emperor's new clothes. The story of the emperor's new clothes is that all the academic philosophers and all the high Hedians and the courtiers and everyone else were going, oh my, look at the emperor's new clothes. It was a wee boy who wasn't supposed to know who said, hey, you've got no clothes. So I think retreating into this academic philosophers say the moral argument is not very good.
Well, some like it. I don't want to give the wrong impression. I mean, some like it, but it's not widely considered one of the best arguments. And in fact, some philosophers think it's just a failure.
Well, I think it's the greatest argument, purely and simply because I know that there is good and evil, and without God, I know there cannot be good and evil. And I think, if we're talking about the origin of evil, and the trouble here is as well, evil and suffering get confused. I think what you're talking about is unnecessary suffering. And then, of course, you've got the problem of determining what's necessary or not necessary. So, for example, when I get a needle stuck into me at the dentist, it is necessary suffering because it's preventing a greater suffering. As a 6-year-old child, I might not be aware of that. And I would say that many of us as humans might not be aware of it. But where I want to go, and there's just the two things, and one is so big that, we will take another hour, and I'm sorry to throw it in here. I think that God made the world good. I think he made it perfect. And I think the question of evil is when humanity sinned, that resulted in a broken world. It does affect our environment. Human beings do pollute the earth. We do create all different kinds of things.
How old do you think the universe is, David?
The universe, I basically don't know, but probably about 4 billion years. So,
right.
I think that when we're dealing with this concept of moral evil and everything else and where we're at, I think human beings are the problem. I remember going into the National Gallery in London, and I saw a poem from Ben Okri, which I was really surprised that it was there because it said this. I've got it here. I loved it. Freedom is a difficult lesson to learn. I have tasted the language of death till it became the water of life. I have shaped a little my canvas of time. I have crossed seas of fires and seen with these African eyes the one light which neither empires nor all the might of men obscure. Man is the sickness, God the cure. And that's what I think. I think man.
So can I ask you a question?
Man is the sickness. Yeah.
So if man is the sickness and we've only been here 300,000 years, how is man responsible for hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering? You said God created the perfect world, so it was perfect with hundreds of millions of years of absolutely appalling suffering.
Well, you're calling it suffering. It's animal death. Yeah. We don't know. I mean, you seem to have a very confident knowledge of what was happening hundreds of millions of years ago. I mean, I'm a historian and I'm struggling to know what happened 10,000 years ago. So,
10,000 years.
Yeah, it is. We are, and until we have written history, right. It is very, very difficult. And an enormous amount of stuff is highly, highly, highly speculative. But I do think the world is probably about 4 billion years old. I think that the question of what you call suffering, necessary suffering, unnecessary suffering, when a lion kills something for its food, is that necessary or unnecessary? When I pick a plant, does the plant suffer? King Charles used to think that it did.
Yeah. Can I ask you another question?
Yeah, sure.
You said that we atheists are suppressing the truth. We deep
Yes.
down, we know the truth. Like, really, I know God exists, your God. And I'm because I want to sin. I'm kind of burying it and suppressing it. Would that go for somebody that's, some poor soul that had a religious faith and lost it and desperately tried to maintain it? But no, really, they're just suppressing it, what they know to be true. Is that your view, David?
No, my view is that we all suppress things about many, many different things. Again, what you resort to is, for an academic philosopher, you resort to some very simplistic arguments,
Well,
which
I'm
I'm
asking
quite
you a
surprised
question.
at, to be honest. But no, you're arguing a question which is a kind of gotcha, and you reduce it to a simplicity, which, that that's not true. It's like someone saying to you, when did you stop beating your wife? Come on. And look, it's not, it's the
What am I
suppression.
suppressing?
What are you suppressing is the knowledge that is evident all around us. It's like somebody saying, well, I don't believe in
What knowledge of
Leonardo da
what?
Vinci or the knowledge of
Knowledge of,
God. Yes.
so I'm suppressing knowledge of God. But that's what I
Yes.
just said. Good.
No,
Okay.
but the knowledge, no, but you talked about someone. The knowledge of God is seen in two different forms. One is
Yeah.
it's seen in what he has created. So for me, when I tried to be an atheist when I was a teenager and I desperately wanted to be an atheist, the reason I couldn't was entirely
Why?
intellectual. Well, I was entirely intellectual because when I walk into a room and I see a painting, I always assume there's an artist. And I lived in the Scottish Highlands, which was stunningly beautiful. I know you live in Oxford. It's kind of beautiful, but not in comparison. And
So to get
when,
back to this suppressing
The
point,
gloves
so
are off now.
I
My
mean,
goodness.
there are people that have lost their faith and they're
yeah.
desperate to get it back and they can't get it back. But according to you, they're suppressing their knowledge of God. Is
Well, you
that
see,
correct?
unlike you,
That's my question.
no, that's well, it's not a question, is it? It's an accusation. The answer
No, but
is
it seemed to be what you're suggesting. So you
no.
said I'm suppressing knowledge of God, so they must be doing that too, presumably. Or if not, why
It's
not?
interesting.
What's going on?
I'm here in Newcastle, and I had a church that's basically dying, just a handful of people, and it's beginning to grow. And where it's growing is with people precisely like you said, two kinds of people. First of all, people who were atheists, including militant atheists, beginning to be curious, wanting to find out more. And secondly, people who have got very disillusioned with the Christian faith, turned away, but there's a sense in which they want to come back, but they're not sure, and all the rest of it. Now, I do not know every single person's heart or everything that's wrong with them. There are general principles that we can apply in circumstances. For example,
But it's not true that all atheists are suppressing knowledge of God.
no, it's true that all human beings. So well, look,
So they are suppressing knowledge of God.
what the Apostle Paul says is that we do suppress the truth. And yes, I think you are suppressing the truth because I think you've invented this philosophical, neat argument which doesn't work because you don't know Christian theology. You try and make a symmetry out of something that nobody has really said. I think it only works in how will I put it, the coffee shops of Oxford. It really doesn't work in reality. And I want to come back to this. I know we're gonna run out of time fairly soon. So what I want to come back to is just simply what we do about it. So I had a woman come in, and where I'm sitting right now, had a woman come in a year ago, almost a year to the day, and her son had just gone and committed suicide, and absolutely distraught. I had no simplistic answers for her, but I did say, I know someone who does. I know someone who can help you. I know someone who brings beauty out of ugliness. And instead of just saying, well, that's ugly, that's just the way it is. And as she's started coming along to church, she started beginning to see, she started grasping that there may be more to this picture than the very pixelated image that you say we have to have and we need to know everything about before we can determine that God is absolutely good. I'm saying we can determine that God is absolutely good because he gave us his son and because of what happened to Christ on the cross. The goodness of God is fundamental. The evilness of man, by the way, is also fundamental because we see it everywhere. You can't deny it. I also would not deny that there is goodness in humanity, but I would say that comes because we're made in the image of God, an image that has gone wrong. But nonetheless, the basic image still remains there. So for me, I have nothing to offer somebody who's suffering without Christ. But I have sat at many deathbeds. I have buried an 18-month-old child who died from a cot death. And you know this, the parents were very strongly atheist. And I remember, I'll never forget this, after the service, and it's one of those things that you absolutely hate, the little white coffin, everything. It was awful. And I thought, how am I going to speak to the parents afterwards? Because they were so angry against God anyway, before. And then on the Sunday, the mother was there, and she came out and I said, "I'm sorry, I have to ask you this. What are you doing here? I thought this was the very last place you wouldn't want to be." And what she said to me was this: if there is no God, none of this makes any sense. And that's exactly what I'm saying. I don't think your position makes sense. And I think with God, you keep saying this is a problem for us. I don't find it a problem at all. I find that the solution to the problem of evil is what God has done.
Okay, back to Stephen. Come on, Stephen. We've got under 10 minutes to go now. Let's wrap.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's get back to the problem of evil, because we keep, you notice the way that constantly we move away from the problem of evil and we start talking about other things. And the reason is it's a really thorny, difficult problem. I can't see that David's offered a response to it at all, really, other than this kind of skeptical theist move, which, as I say, is fairly fashionable with some sort of academic philosophers, and but not others. Others reject it completely, even Christian ones. Richard Swinburne, again, as an example of somebody that rejects skeptical theism. So the idea basically is that the person running the evidential problem of evil is in no position to know that it's unlikely that there's a good God-justifying reason for hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering or 300,000 years of very high childhood mortality rates. And sometimes they use an analogy involving a garage. So where you keep your car, you look into the garage from the outside, you can't see any elephants. If you can't see them, there's probably no elephant there. That's a reasonable conclusion to draw. It's a no-see-em inference from I can't see it, so it's probably not there. And that works for elephants. It doesn't work for insects, obviously, because our ability to detect insects at a distance is much more limited. And so there could easily be insects there, even if we can't see them. And so the skeptical theist says, so similarly then, just because we can't think of a reason why God would allow, hundreds of millions of years of unimaginable horror before we even show up, doesn't mean that there isn't some good reason back there. Just because we can't think of it doesn't mean that it's not there. It's basically the skeptical theist's line. The problem with playing this card, this kind of skeptical card, is a sort of get out of jail free card, is it works just as well, first of all, notice, in defense of belief in an evil God. I mean, for all I know, there's a really good reason for the love, the laughter, the ice cream, the rainbows, the nurses, the hospitals, and so on. A really good evil reason for it. Just because I can't think of it doesn't mean it's not there. So it works just as well. And yet we know, don't we? Well, I think I do, that the amount of good that we see around us is more than enough to comfortably rule out a supremely powerful and malevolent creator. Okay, skeptical theism doesn't work there. We can all see that, I suspect. So why do you think it's going to work in defense of belief in a good God? A second problem with skeptical theism is the skepticism runs all over the place. Once you've opened the Pandora's box of skepticism to give you your get out of jail free card, so far as the problem of evil is concerned, you have to start being skeptical about other things too. So for all you know, there's a good reason for a good God to deceive you. And he does do deceiving. He does it in the Bible. There are examples of it. There's a good reason for God to deceive you about various things, such as the existence of the external world, the past. The entire universe could be 5 minutes old. How do you know it isn't? I mean, there could easily be a reason for God to deceive you about that. And if you can't reasonably rule that out, then for all you know, it is, only 5 minutes old. The truth of the Christian religion. Christianity, why should I believe it's true? Well, the God and the Bible say it's true, but maybe they're deceiving us. How do you know that there isn't a really good reason for God to deceive us about the truth of Christianity? Well, you don't know that because of skeptical theism. Once you've opened the door to skepticism to get you out of trouble, you have to start being skeptical about lots of other things too. And it's a kind of skepticism that the Christian is not going to accept. They're not going to say, oh no, I can't know that Christianity is true. They do. They believe that they can know that Christianity is true. So so skeptical theism, not by no means do all academic philosophers that are Christians sign up to it. Plenty reject it. There are obvious drawbacks with it, including that it would also salvage belief in an evil God, which seems ludicrous, and it has the very unfortunate consequence that you lose knowledge of the external world and the Christian religion.
We've got about 3 minutes for, 2 to 3 minutes, let's say 2 minutes for you, David, to respond and also wrap up your thoughts on this debate.
again, I've noticed an interesting thing with Stephen. He keeps presenting arguments I'm not using. I'm not an academic philosopher. I'm not using skeptical theism. I'm a very optimistic theist. I'm not skeptical at all in that. I'm very skeptical about lots and lots of different things, including, I have to say, I'm very skeptical about specialist religious philosophers. But I am skeptical about some of the facts that you've been stating as well. And no, I don't go with fashionable philosophers, and I don't go with internet memes. This is it's such a, how we know anything. I mean, I'm quite surprised you played the Matrix card. How do we know that we're actually alive just now? How do we know that we're not wired up to a computer which is telling us that we're alive? How do we know anything? We can actually know nothing. I would say I know by evidence. And I remember being asked this before by an atheist, again, a president of an atheist society in university, who told me I destroyed his atheism. I don't believe I can do yours, but I know that God can. Which will certainly give you proof of him. But he then said, "What do you believe?" And I started giving him all the evidence, and I thought, oh, forget this, forget the ontological argument and everything else. I just spoke about Christ, and Christ is my answer to the problem of suffering. Christ is my answer to why Christianity is true. And I think, you have the same problem. How do you know that anything that you say is true? Because it's limited to the capacity of your own mind, which you would be humble enough to admit that is fairly limited. And when people say scientific evidence, well, it depends how you determine how science works. I mean, there are so many different ways. I mean, I remember once saying to somebody, and in fact, it was an Oxford mathematician who said this to me, saying, look, the only things we can prove are things like maths, that 2 and 2 is 4. And he came up and said, look, I need to say something to you. And I said, what's that? I said, please don't tell me 2 and 2 is not 4. And he said, well, in a binary system it is, but in another kind of system it isn't. And you can mess with people's heads like that. But I go with the evidence that's there. I go with the evidence of the creation. I go with the evidence of revelation, because God can reveal things. But most of all, I think that's probably most of all is what I would go with that. But also, I've seen it work numerous times. How do you know a particular medicine works? You try it out, you look at it, and it works with people. I've seen the problem of suffering dealt with by God's answer to suffering, which is Jesus Christ. And I think ultimately you have no equivalent answer to that. And so I think that's where I would want to leave it. I mean, for me, it really is that straightforward. I know that tomorrow when I meet suffering people, I've got something to give them, and I know that it's real, and I know that it works. And I feel sorry for those who are stuck still believing in the emperor's new clothes.
Well, we don't want to be unfair and let the show end with David talking about the cross. So, Stephen, we will give you the final word. So just less than a minute, please, just to wrap up your thoughts on today's discussion.
Oh, okay. Well, we've been looking at the problem of evil, which is a very specific problem, the problem of evil, problem of suffering. We've been looking at the evidential version of that, which is that there's just such a quantity of pain and suffering, in particular going back hundreds of millions of years before human beings even existed, so we can't be to blame for that. 300,000 years of very high childhood mortality rates, that's not our fault. We didn't do that. You need to be able to square that with the existence of a supremely powerful and benevolent creator. It seems, there are all sorts of ways in which people have tried to respond. They've cooked up explanations in terms of free will and so on, and then they've appealed to skeptical theism, which David is appealing to, but he just doesn't want to call it that. But the idea that there could be reasons beyond our care, and that is skeptical theism. None of these moves work. I mean, even many theists will happily admit that the theodicies aren't really up to the job, and others will say, no, it's true, skeptical theism is not plausible. We can't really play that card, and so on. So it's just a big problem, and we haven't really seen any adequate response to it today. Maybe there is one, but I don't know what it is. And in fact, to me, it just seems pretty obvious. Look out the window, you can see there's no evil God because there's too much good.
Sure.
Most of us can recognize that. It seems pretty obvious to me that there's no good God either, and we're engaged in a kind of self-delusion when we somehow manage to convince ourselves that no, there really is a supremely powerful and benevolent mind behind everything that's responsible for everything. I mean, maybe there's a mind back there, but but it's not all evil, is it? And it's not all good either. So cross those two candidates off your list, please.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I said in part 2 that I felt like I was at a picnic. I wasn't having to do very much work. And like any good picnic, there has been plenty to feast on, and there are plenty of leftovers. We've been talking about suffering and whether suffering is the best argument for atheism. To one of our discussees, Dr. Stephen Law, he thinks that it's quite obvious because of the amount of suffering, the level of gratuitous suffering, that there is no God. For Reverend David Robertson, it's very obvious from the existence of suffering that if not proves, but at least points towards the gospel, the idea of Jesus. And he says that in him we find our hope in the midst of suffering. I have to say, I've been hosting a show for 2.5 years. We always prepare a list of questions, a long list of questions to ask each of the opponents. And I used one. And I mean this as a compliment to both Stephen and David, because you can't cover everything in a 1 hour show, but their intelligence, their learning, their reading, their ability to unpack things and to engage in not a nitpicking way, but I think a nicely adversarial way is credit to both of them. So thank you both, to you, Stephen, and to you, David, on behalf of myself, Andy Kind, and all the team here at Unbelievable. Thanks for watching. Do tune in again. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, like and subscribe on YouTube. Email us, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. And we'll see you again soon for another amazing Unbelievable.